The second bone in the forearm is the ulna. This is the ulna and this is the radius. So the second bone in the forearm is the ulna, and the ulna is located over the medial side of the forearm. The ulna is articulated proximally with the trochlea of the humerus and articulated with the head of the radius through the proximal radio-ulnar joint. And articulated distally. Distally it is not articulated, not like the radius. Ulna articulated proximal with the humerus through the trochlea, and articulated with the head of the radius through the proximal radio-ulnar joint, articulated here. This is the trochlea and the ulna here, and this is the radius articulated with the radius head, articulated with the capitellum, and articulated with the ulna through the here a notch. We call it radial notch, and the ulna distally, the ulna is not articulated with the wrist, not like the radius. The radius articulated distally through two bones. The radius articulated proximally and distally. Proximally articulate with the humerus through the capitellum, and articulate the head also articulate with the ulna through the radial notch. While distally, the radius articulated with the two bones in the wrist, which are the scaphoid and the lunate. Scaphoid and lunate, and we see here there are two surfaces here. One, the lateral one is for the scaphoid, we call it scaphoid notch, while the distal one, the medial side is we call it the lunate notch for the lunate bone. Back to the ulna. The ulna, as we said, articulated proximally with the two bones, with the humerus through the trochlea and with the radial head. The proximal part of the ulna is bigger than the distal part. The proximal is big, and this part we call it olecranon process. The olecranon process entirely has a very big notch. You see this notch, very big notch. This notch is for articulation of the trochlea of the humerus. So this notch, because it's articulated with the trochlea, we call it trochlear notch. Very big notch, trochlear notch for articulation with the trochlea of the humerus. Just distal to this notch, there's a big process anteriorly. You see this process directed anteriorly. In this direction, directed anteriorly, and we call it, you see in the lateral position, lateral view, how it is protruded anteriorly. This is, we call it coronoid process. So the proximal part, all this part, we call it olecranon process. Anteriorly notch, big notch, trochlear notch. Anterior process, we call it coronoid process. Over the medial surface of the coronoid process, we have a notch here, small notch. This is for articulation. We call it the radial notch for articulation with the radius. Just here, very important point in anatomy. Any notch, what articulated, we take the name. So this notch articulated with the trochlea, we call it trochlear notch. And this notch for articulation of the head of the radius, so we call it radial notch. This, as we said before, this tuberosity for insertion of the biceps, we call it bicipital tuberosity. This is, we see it very widely common in anatomy. In the shaft, the medial border, we see the medial border is sharp, and this is same likewise for the medial border of the radius. The lateral border of the ulna, like the medial border of the ulna, which is, both of them are sharp for the attachment of the interosseous membrane. This is the second video for the ulna. The posterior part of the ulna, this is the radius and this is the ulna. The posterior part of the ulna here, the posterior part of the ulna, we have over the medial here. This is the radius and this is the ulna here. Over the posterior part, and laterally we have a crest here. We call it the supinator crest. From its name, supinator, because this is the origin of the supinator muscle. The supinator muscle come from here, and this is the radius and ulna. These are articulated like this way. Come from here. If I separate it, the supinator come from here and went around the proximal part of the radius. Come from here and went around the proximal part of the radius. It attached, the supinator inserted over the anterior surface of the radius, lateral surface and posterior surface. If you pay attention to this direction of the supinator, come from here, the crest, supinator crest, and went around here. Why? Because if the forearm pronation, when it contract, it will do supination. That's why we call it supinator. So it come from the ulna and went around the radius. When it contract, it will rotate it in this way. This is the distal part, third video of the ulna. The distal part of the ulna, if we pay attention here, it is round, and this is, we call it the head. We don't have neck, we call it the head, the distal small part of the ulna. If you pay attention, the proximal part of the ulna is bigger than the distal part, while the radius is, the distal part is bigger than the proximal part. The radius is more wider than the ulna, and it is bowed, I mean curved. The distal part of the ulna, we call it round, and we call it the head. We have a process here medially, like the process of the radius, which is laterally. This is, we call styloid process of the ulna, while this is the styloid process of the radius. Very important point, ulna don't articulate in the wrist. There is a cartilage, there's a cartilage here, separate the ulna from the wrist joint, while the radius is the one which is responsible to form the radial joint, the wrist joint. The wrist joint composed of articulation of the radius with the scaphoid and the lunate, while the ulna is not included in the wrist joint.